Hi, my name is Chasta Musenda, and I want to thank you for listening to today's message. I hope this message challenges you to know Christ, experience community, and influence culture.
As we wrap up our series, each one of us have uttered two words that all of us have kept at various times in our lives, and each one of us have also uttered the same two words, and at various times in our lives we have not kept them. And the two words are simply, I promise. We utter those words when a friend whispers a secret in our ear, and we promise not to repeat it. We say those words when someone holds us to an important commitment, maybe at home or at work, and we make a promise to do what we say we will do. We say those words at a wedding when we stand at the altar and say, I do. There is a promise that we make, and while some promises are kept and some promises are broken, we find in God the greatest promise keeper of all. And to understand God's promises, today I want us to go back into the Old Testament, and I want to look at the life of a man by the name of Isaac. Isaac was the son of Abraham and Sarah. We talked about Abraham about 3 or 4 weeks ago when we kicked off our series. Isaac is their son. And the promise that God made to Abraham many years earlier was not just a promise for Abraham, but rather was a promise that was passed down to his son Isaac and would be passed down to generation after generation. And in Genesis chapter 26, we read a summary of that promise that God made to Abraham and is now being passed down to Isaac. This is what God says to Isaac in Genesis 26, beginning in verse 3. I hereby confirm that I will give all these lands to you and your descendants, just as I solemnly promised Abraham your father. I will cause your descendants to become as numerous as the stars of the sky, and I will give them all these lands. And through your descendants, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. I will do this because Abraham listened to me and obeyed all my requirements, commands, and decrees and instructions. So God gives this promise to Abraham, and if you follow it down the line, you discover that this promise actually makes its way all the way to the coming of the Messiah, Jesus. And so the promise is made years before that ever takes place. And yet, if you follow the line, you discover Jesus was in that line of Abraham. But this isn't just any promise. It's not just a promise between friends. It's not just a promise between co-workers. It is a promise between God and his people. And as you read the entire chapter of Genesis 26, you discover 3 extraordinary traits about the transcending nature of God's promises. And that's where I want to turn our attention this morning. The first trait of God's promises is that God's promises transcend your circumstances. Genesis 26, verse 1 begins this way. A severe famine now struck the land, as had happened before in Abraham's time. So Isaac moved to Gerar, where Abimelech, king of the Philistines, lived. Now, famines were not uncommon in this time or in this part of the world. In fact, as it says, Abraham and Sarah had also experienced a famine that forced them to move. When they moved to Egypt. But when this famine hits, Isaac gets up and he moves to Gerar. But then look what happens next, verse 2 and 3. The Lord appeared to Isaac and said, do not go down to Egypt, but do as I tell you. Live here as a foreigner in this land, and I will be with you and bless you. I want you to notice 2 truths in this passage. The first one is this: God still speaks in the famine. You may be here today and you may be in a famine moment in your life. It may be a spiritual famine. It may be an emotional famine as you're dealing with depression or anxiety. It might be a physical famine where there's sickness in your body. It might be a relational famine where you feel like a relationship that's important to you is about to collapse. You may be here today and you're encountering a famine. You feel alone. You feel ignored. You feel like you're in that space of uncertainty. I want to remind us today that famine might stifle your circumstances, but it does not silence God's voice. God still speaks in the midst of our famine. Here's the second truth, and maybe this is the hard one. God still speaks in the famine, but God says in the famine, whatever he says requires trust. How many of you, God has ever, you've just sensed a nudge from the Holy Spirit? It wasn't like an audible voice. Maybe it was, I don't know, but it wasn't like an audible voice, but you sensed a definitive nudge that you knew this is the Spirit of God guiding me, directing me, speaking to me. In fact, sometimes whenever I refer to the voice of God, I'll say, it's kind of like that nudge. It's like you're hanging out with, like you ever gone to the movie before and you're watching the movie and something happens in the movie and the person you're there with, it's like there's something between the two of you where whatever you just saw on the screen makes you kind of laugh, right? Because you relate to it in some way, and you don't say a word and your friend doesn't say a word, they just nudge you. And you know exactly what they mean. Sometimes I think that's the way the voice of God is. Sometimes the Holy Spirit will nudge us and you know what he's saying. You know what he's directing you to do. You know the direction he's leading you to go. Sometimes in those moments, whatever he is saying requires a level of trust that maybe you haven't had before. What does God say to Isaac? He says, do not go down to Egypt. Live here as a foreigner in this land. Why would God say that to Isaac? Probably for a couple of reasons. One, the fertile valleys in Egypt made that a good place to go if you wanted your crops to flourish and you wanted your animals to flourish. So probably, naturally, Isaac's thinking, man, that's the place to go. Things are going to grow. Things are going to flourish if I go there. And then secondly, he's probably thinking that's where I should go because that's where my parents went. When a famine hit the land, my parents, Abraham and Sarah, they left and they went to Egypt. If it was good enough for them, it's probably good enough for me. There was precedent for Isaac to follow. But God had a different plan. God tells Isaac, don't go to Egypt, live here as a foreigner, but then God makes a promise to Isaac. He says, hey, if you'll do this, if you won't go where your flesh wants you to go, if you'll stay where you feel like you don't maybe even fit in, you're a foreigner, then guess what? I will be with you and bless you. In other words, my presence and my provision are going to take care of you right where you are. Listen to me. God doesn't need Egypt to keep his promises. God is quite capable of keeping his promises without the help of Egypt. And in your life today, Egypt may represent a whole bunch of different things, but I just want to remind us today that God is quite capable of taking care of us, of fulfilling his promise, of meeting our need without the help of the thing we want to impose on it. Yeah. Sometimes we think, God, let me help you out. Anybody been guilty of that before? Like you know what maybe the Lord has promised you, or you sense a direction God is leading you, and your response is, God, let me help you out. Let me tell you how this ought to go, God. And so we project onto God how we think he should work on our behalf. God, I'll tell you what, God, I'll write the book if you'll put it on the New York Times bestseller list. God, I'm going to make this really easy. I'll buy the lotto ticket if you'll just make a win. That's all. I mean, that's easy enough for both of us, right? Nothing's impossible. God, I'll ask my boss for a raise, and then you can make him say yes and double it. Hear me. God's promises are not dependent on your circumstances. His promises transcend your circumstances. So whatever makes sense up here, like it may logically and humanly make sense here, but we operate in a different currency. The currency of heaven is faith. And boy, do we struggle with that. Because we already have an idea of how it ought to work out and the way it ought to go and what God ought to do. And sometimes we cross this line where we impose on God what he must do. But God's promises aren't dependent on any of that. Your circumstances have never baffled God. God has never looked at your problem, never looked at your circumstance and went, I need to think about that one. God's never stumped by our problems. God has never thrown off. Hear me. He's not even thrown off by your anger toward him. So what does Isaac do? Boy, this is a simple verse. Verse 6, here's what Isaac does. So Isaac stayed in Gerar. Some of you, it takes faith to go. But some of you, it takes faith to stay. I mean, let's just be honest. Some of us are kind of wired where, man, let's go. Come on. We always got an idea. We always got a better way, a better place to go, a better we should do that, right? And in our mind, everything is always greener on the other side. Listen to me. If you're not careful, you'll move before God's done with you where you are right now. Because you don't like the pain you're experiencing right now. You don't like the hardship, the tests, the trials. It's boring where you are right now. Let me just tell you something. There is success in boredom. So what do you mean? Whatever in your mind you think excitement, adventure looks like, do you really think anybody wakes up every single day doing that? Nobody wakes up every single day doing their highlight reel on social media. Nobody. They post the 5 minutes of fame and don't tell you about the other 23 hours and 55 minutes of boredom. And yet, it's in the routine, it's in the boredom that God is often forming and shaping our character. He's molding us into who he wants us to be. He's saying, hey, can you trust me to stay right where you are so I can do the development in your character that needs to happen? No, God, you don't understand. Lord, if you'll just give me A, B, and C, this whole thing would be far better. And God says, if I give you A, B, and C, it will crush you.
Come on. He knows.
But if we'll trust him, and say, okay, God, I'm going to plant myself. I'm going to stay where you've put me. You've led me here. I'm going to trust you, God. Yeah. Not just when it's good. I'm going to trust you, God, in the routine. I'm going to trust you in the boredom. I'm going to trust you, God, when things get tough, the hardships mount, the tests and trials come. Because hear me, if you run from it, you won't grow from it. And therefore, it will show up somewhere else down the road. None of that was even in my notes. Boy, that was good. All right. So God's promises, They transcend your circumstances. Here's the second one, and this one might challenge you a little bit. It might throw you off a little. God's promises transcend your sin. This might sound strange, maybe even untrue, but follow me, okay? Follow me here. As you continue to read Isaac's story, I want you to notice what he does, okay? He's gotten settled, he's in Gerar and everything. Verse 7, look what happens. When the men who lived there asked Isaac about his wife, Rebekah, he said, "She is my sister." Pause. Rebekah is Isaac's wife. When he's asked about his wife, he doesn't say, "She's my wife." He says, "She's my sister." You got the picture? Doesn't that sound familiar? If you know the story of Abraham and Sarah, you kind of go, like father, like son. He was afraid to say, "She is my wife." He thought, they will kill me to get her because she is so beautiful. The story continues. Look what he says next. But sometime later, Abimelech, king of the Philistines, looked out his window and saw Isaac caressing Rebekah. Immediately, Abimelech called for Isaac and exclaimed, "She is obviously your wife. Why did you say she is my sister?" "Because I was afraid someone would kill me to get her from me," Isaac replied. "How could you do this to us?" Abimelech exclaimed. "One of my people might easily have taken your wife and slept with her, and you would have made us guilty of great sin." Now what's happening here? Because the king thought Rebekah was Isaac's sister, he had her brought to his palace because he and his wife were childless. And so he's thinking, I can have a baby. I can have a child. So why then would King Abimelech say, "You have made us guilty of great sin"? Why would he say that? He probably has the backstory on a very similar situation that happened years and years earlier with Abraham and Sarah. You see, years earlier, Abraham told a different king who was also named Abimelech, he told that king the same thing, that his wife Sarah was his sister, not his wife. And because he tells that, he says that, and so Abimelech and his wife, like they don't have children, and immediately he's thinking about, he goes back to this situation where this is all played out again, because here's the details of that situation. If you go back to Abraham and Sarah, whenever that king, also named Abimelech, the same thing happens, this is how that scenario plays out. That Abimelech has a dream. And this is what it says. But sometime later, Abimelech, king of the Philistines, looked out his window. Next passage, guys. There we go. But that night, God came to Abimelech in a dream and told him, "You are a dead man, for that woman you have taken is already married." But Abimelech had not slept with her yet. So he said, "Lord, will you destroy an innocent nation? Didn't Abraham tell me she is my sister?" And she herself said, "Yes, he is my brother. I acted in complete innocence. My hands are clean." So get the picture. This king Abimelech, who was around when Abraham was alive, is freaking out because he realizes this could turn out very poorly for me. He is scared to death of the judgment that God might release on him. But look how God responds in this dream to Abimelech. In the dream, God responded, "Yes, I know you are innocent. That's why I kept you from sinning against me and why I did not let you touch her. Now return the woman to her husband." Her husband again was Abraham. "And he will pray for you, for he is a prophet. then you will live. But if you don't return her to him, you can be sure that you and all your people will die. So what happens? Abimelech wakes up from his dream. He goes and he gets Sarah. He has her returned to Abraham. Abraham prays for him because they are childless. And everything turns out fine. That's the first Abimelech. Now, fast forward about 90 years to this other Abimelech that we read in Isaac's story. And to be honest, we don't really know if his name was Abimelech or if Abimelech was actually a title given to kings, kind of like Caesar or Pharaoh. So whatever it was, he was referred to either way as Abimelech. When King Abimelech realizes now that Isaac's wife, Rebekah, is not his wife but his sister, his mind probably goes back to Abraham and Sarah, and he's reminded the judgment of God almost fell on him. And so he's thinking, I'm at risk of the judgment of God now falling on me. That's why he said, how could you do this to us, Isaac? He's thinking back 90 years ago. He knew the story. In other words, how could you bring God's judgment on us in the same way judgment almost came upon the king years ago with your parents, Abraham and Sarah? So what happens next? Verse 11. Then Abimelech issued a public proclamation. Anyone who touches this man or his wife will be put to death. You kind of get the idea. Abimelech is trying to score points with God right now, right? Right? God, I'll do anything. Like, just don't kill me, right? I'll do anything. Here's the crazy part of the story. King Abimelech was afraid of God's judgment. But Isaac was the one who lied. That didn't even make sense. You're like, what? Time out. Isn't Isaac the one who's guilty here? What's up with that? Was Isaac justified in his lying? Was Isaac lying in this situation and it's kind of like God looked the other way and this is okay? No, lying was not justified and lying was not okay. In fact, hear this. When Isaac lied, it actually revealed his unwillingness to trust God in this situation. Think about it. God had told Isaac not to go to Egypt, where the valleys were fertile, but to stay as a foreigner in this land in Gerar, and that if he did, that God would be with him and that God would bless him. He had already given him those instructions, and Isaac had already obeyed those instructions. God was basically saying, Isaac, if you will trust me and stay here in Gerar, I'll take care of you. And God did, and Isaac did. But then his trust in God goes out the window when it comes to his wife Rebekah, and so Isaac lies to help God out. You ever been there? I'm not sure God's big enough to get me out of this, so I better help him out. I'm going to fabricate something that's not true. So how does God respond? Rather than throwing his promise to Isaac and his descendants out the window, God actually protects Isaac and Rebekah, and he remembers his promise to them. Boy, something doesn't seem fair in this story. Somebody deserved judgment. And not only did God not show judgment to the king, God didn't show judgment toward Isaac and Rebekah either. Hear me. Why? Why would God even do that? Because God's promises even transcend sin. Now, I know I'm at risk of being severely misinterpreted right now, okay? Because here's what I am not saying. I'm not saying that sin is no big deal to God. Okay? Let me make it very clear. It cost him his son. Okay? So I'm not saying sin's no big deal to God. I'm not saying that God that God justified what he did. Instead, you have to understand that God's promise was not just to Isaac. God's promise was generational. It started with his father Abraham, it went to Isaac, and it went all the way down the line until Jesus the Messiah comes on the scene. Not even Abraham, who did the same thing, or Isaac, not their sin, for either one of them, could stop the promise of God that would transcend one generation to the next, to the next, to the next, to the next, to the coming of the Messiah. God's promises are more powerful than our sin. They transcend it. And today I want you to know that God's promise transcends your sin as well, because God's grace is greater than your sin. You may say, Stephen, you don't understand. You don't know what I've done. You don't know what I've said. You don't know who I've hurt. And you're exactly right. I don't know what you've done, what you've said, or who you've hurt. But here's what I do know. God made a promise a long time ago, and the promise goes like this. In Acts 2, verse 21, it says, whoever calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved. There are no except for A, B, C, and D. No, this is for whoever. That if you'll humble yourself before God and say, God, I can't save myself. My sin has separated me from you. God doesn't say, I'm sorry, my promise ran out last week. No, his promise from way, way back came all the way to the coming of Jesus the Messiah. And what Jesus did at the cross extends all the way to you today on September the 1st, 2024, right here, right now. That's a promise none of us deserve, but it's a promise that is greater than our sin. Again, this doesn't give us a license to sin. That's an abuse of the grace of God. It's not a license to sin. It's recognizing that my sin, no matter how great it is, no matter how great it feels, no matter the guilt and the shame I feel right now, God's grace, his promise extends all the way to me. That brings us to our final truth about God's promises. Number 3, God's promises transcend our opposition. When you receive the promise of salvation through Jesus Christ, with that promise comes a lot of other amazing promises from God. You can read throughout Scripture where God makes promises time and time and time again, where he makes promises that you and I can hold on to today. But here's what you need to know. Those promises you can hold on today. It doesn't mean there won't be opposition to those promises. And that's exactly what happens to Isaac. Genesis 26, look at verse 12 and 13. When Isaac planted his crops, okay, so this whole situation passes. He settles down, he plants his crops. He harvested 100 times more grain than he planted. For the Lord blessed him. He became a very rich man, and his wealth continued to grow. That sounds good. Some of you are like, sign me up. Like, how does that work for me? Hear me. God is simply fulfilling his promise to Isaac. He said, I will be with you and I will bless you. And that's exactly what he's doing in this passage. But then, That promise that's being fulfilled, in the midst of that, Isaac faces unrelenting opposition. You see, Isaac becomes so wealthy that the Philistines become jealous of him. Side note, when someone else is blessed, learn to celebrate it.
That's right.
Because if you can't celebrate their blessing, you've revealed to God your inσecurity to handle his blessing in your own life. The Philistines become jealous of him. As a result, the Philistines fill Isaac's wells with dirt. Now, these were wells that his father, Abraham, had dug. And now they're filled with dirt. So then, King Abimelech orders Isaac to leave Gerar. He packs up, he moves to the Gerar Valley, and while he's there, then he starts to dig a new well. But when he digs that well, some shepherds from Gerar come and they claim the well as their own. Boy, jealousy multiplies. So then he goes further and he digs another well, and the exact same thing happens. Now, if you've faced that kind of opposition, you've basically been run out of town. The wells that were yours have been filled with dirt. You dig another well, it's taken from you. You dig another well, it's taken from you. You kind of start to feel like, okay, what's up, God? Why am I experiencing this opposition? And I'm sure there is a temptation to say, I'm thrown in the towel. I am done with this. But Isaac doesn't quit. Instead, look what happens, verse 22. Abandoning that one, Isaac moved on and dug another well. This is his third one to dig. This time, there was no dispute over it. So Isaac named the place Rehoboth, which means open space. One translation says wide open space. For he said, at last the Lord has created enough space for us to prosper in this land. Listen, God has made promises to his followers. And for some of you, he's made a very personal promise about something in your life or your family or a situation you're walking through. And God has just really encouraged you and comforted you with a very specific promise. Hear me. Opposition will come when God makes a promise to you. But when the opposition comes, don't stop digging new wells. Now, I love this passage because it reminds me of a promise that God gave to me 12 years ago. See, in January of 2012, I went to Starbucks over on Hewlin Street, and I'm sitting in there, and sometimes I would go there at that time, and I would take my Bible in there, and I would open it, and I would read, and I would pray. And I remember I went to Starbucks that morning, and I opened my Bible to this passage, Genesis chapter 26, and I read everything that we've talked about this morning. But when I got to verse 22, and I read that Isaac dug another well, and he named that place Rehoboth, which means open space, suddenly something just came alive inside me, and I just sensed the Holy Spirit in that moment say, Stephen, it is time to dig a new well. And it was 9 months later that we planted Seven City Church. And so every time I read that passage, I'm reminded, Stephen, you're living in a well right now. The Holy Spirit said, hey, it's time to dig a new well. It's time. There's an open space that I'm leading you into, Stephen. And it's time to take that step of faith, to trust him, to dig that new well. And you know, that was 12 years ago. 9 months later, God does something beautiful as we start Seven City. But can I tell you today, we're digging another well right now. We're digging another well. We're digging a well called a coffee house that one day will sit in the corner of that lobby that will serve our city and our community. And if you've been here for any length of time this year, you've heard the miracles that God has already done to prepare us for that vision, to prepare us for that moment. That's another well that we're digging. That's what we're doing collectively as a church. But listen to me today. God is calling some of you personally to dig a new well. Like there's a well collectively that we've dug, but God is calling some of you personally to dig another well. And my challenge to you today is, will you trust him? Will you trust him? In this series, we've looked at four people in the Old Testament. We've looked at Abraham, we've looked at Elijah, we've looked at Moses, and today we've looked at Isaac. Do you know what every single one of them have in common? Every single one of them had to trust God with something. Abraham had to trust God whenever he said, hey, leave this land and I'm going to take you to another land. He didn't even know where he was going, and yet he went. Moses had to trust God whenever he shows up at a burning bush and says, hey, I want you to go back to Egypt. I want you to deliver my people out of Egyptian bondage. And Moses gives God 5 excuses of why this is a bad idea. And he has to trust God and go. Elijah had to trust God whenever the widow's son died. And he takes the boy up to the bedroom and he's like, God, this is unacceptable. And God raises the boy from the dead. Isaac had to trust God. I'm not going to go to Egypt. I'm going to Gerar. He had to trust God. Okay, that well didn't work. I'm going to dig another well. That one didn't work. I'm going to dig another well. I don't know what it is in your life that maybe you're saying, I've not been trusting God with this thing, with this area, with this space. But this morning, my friend, God's desire and his invitation is that, hey, I've got promises I want to fulfill in your life, but you're going to have to trust me. You're going to have to trust me. Would you bow your heads?
Thanks so much for listening to this message. If you'd like to learn more about Seven City Church, you can visit sevencitychurch.com. Or if you're in the Fort Worth area, we'd love to invite you to our Sunday service. God bless you and have a great day.